Some time ago, during a lightning round yes or no interview with Yoshinori Kitase, it was confirmed that Final Fantasy VII and X take place within the same world. Kind of. A little. He goes slightly further into it, bringing up the character Shinra from Final Fantasy X-2, saying that the scenario writer behind Final Fantasy X and X-2, Kazushige Nojima, suggests that they might be connected and leaves us there.
FF7 and FF10 take place in the same world.
Oh! Whoa! Whoa!
Really? キャラクターで天に死んだ君っていうのが出てくるので、セブンの死んだカンパニーに少しつながりがあるんではないかっていうのはシナリオ内。
A lot of the response towards this has been the typical one that we've seen repeated through the years since X-2 has come out, as this is not the first time that he has said this exact same thing. Still, it has been on my mind a lot, but not for the typical lore reasons that you tend to see covered in most articles and videos about this connection that usually bring up Shinra and leave it at that, or try to go overly far to justify the lore of Final Fantasy VII by attaching Final Fantasy X to its past. My interest lies in the thematic meaning behind Final Fantasy X's writing, something that is often overlooked when discussing it, so just connecting plot points of the two games without examining that feels like doing both of them a disservice. Because of this, I'm making my own video with my view on the connections between Final Fantasy VII and X, not to justify connection points between the games from a storied perspective, but how elements of the two games, in terms of setting and story, are connected from a creative standpoint. Because whenever Yoshinori Kitase talks about the connection, the word he's using comes down to how he feels and thinks these connections are kind of there. It's not entirely direct outside of the Shinra cutscene, and my feelings towards the connection between the two is on the same level. It strikes me as the same as explaining Metal Gear Solid 2's story using lore and expository explanations from Metal Gear Solid 4, when all the meaning of Metal Gear Solid 2 is contained within itself and the contrast that it makes with the first game.
I've got Emma Emmerich here. We've managed to avoid drowning. Good job.
If for some reason you're familiar with Metal Gear Solid 2 and you don't know what I mean, there's a series of blog posts called Driving Off the Map that is worth checking out. Anyway, there will be spoilers ahead, so don't watch this if you have not played Final Fantasy VII or X. As much as I don't care for the direct narrative link between Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X-2, I do think it's worth looking at the Shinra cutscene and appreciate it for what it is, because it's there for a genuine reason beyond making the X series a prequel to Final Fantasy VII's setting.
What are you looking at? Farplane data. The more I study it, the more fascinating it gets. There's limitless energy swirling around in there.
Limitless energy?
The life force that flows through our planet, I think. With a little work, we could probably extract the energy in a usable form.
Sweet!
Of course, that'd take generations.
That's no fun!
Well, still, it is something worth shooting for.
Think how much Spira would change if we ever got it to work. Maybe one day we could build a city full of light, one that never sleeps.
No doubt about it.
Just imagine. But I'll never get to see it, will I?
Shinra! Don't make Yuna sad!
A young boy called Shinra tells Yuna he's investigating a way to tap into the planet's lifestream, into a source of energy to power technology in larger quantities. What surprises me about this scene and how often it's brought up is that people didn't make the more direct connection already during Final Fantasy X itself, as all the elements for it are there already. Even in discussions about the connection, it's rarely brought up as a legitimate thing, likely because the way it's handled is very loose. I believe that the scene was put there in the hopes of making more people notice the more indirect links between the two settings instead of making people go crazy theorizing about lore the way that they are now. Going back to the recent interview from Yoshinori Kitase, there's a much more revealing answer to the question immediately following the one about Final Fantasy VII and X.
Final Fantasy VII is set in Japan after a big accident.
ウォールマーケットっていう街があって、ちょっと歌舞伎町に行ける。
ってことは、10も日本が舞台ですか？
日本、10は日本じゃないけど、ちょっとアジアンなテイストを入れるっていうのは当時から。
What he's actually saying is that Final Fantasy VII's locations are directly based on real locations in Japan, which should be obvious enough looking at it. Of course, the general response to this is, wow, it really does take place in the same world, so does Final Fantasy X take place in Japan too? To which he replies that yes, there are certainly elements in Final Fantasy X that relate to Japanese culture, which is something that is more understandable to a Japanese audience as it goes beyond just the down-to-earth aesthetic of the game and the costumes in it. Final Fantasy X's main story is based on Susanoo and the Yamato no Orochi, with Susanoo being banished from his home in the heavens and being sent down to the mortal world, where he meets two deities weeping because they have to sacrifice their daughters to Yamato no Orochi to keep it from destroying their homes. Their wish comes true with the 8th daughter coming in with a plan to break the cycle by getting the monster drunk with wine and killing it while it's intoxicated.
Have you found a way to truly defeat sin?
Well... We think the Hymn of the Faith might slow sin down.
If it works, what'll you do then? You need more than the hymn.
Well... We fight you, Yevon.
How strongly the game's narrative follows Japanese folklore may not be immediately apparent in the West, while also the representation of Roman Catholic faith, both in form of the way the game's story acts as an attack on organized religion, while being accepting towards the smaller comforts within the routine of faith, might not fully hit the Japanese audience the way it does us. Knowing both of these themes are there, you get to see the contrast, something that's worked into the game far enough that it's essentially in one of the major pieces of promotional art for the game, as the two main characters, representing the sun and the moon, appear in a yin-yang formation. The real connection between Final Fantasy VII and X is that of the way Final Fantasy X takes inspiration from Final Fantasy VII and uses its story beats and themes to contrast it. Keeping this in mind, let's go and examine the connection between the two games through the mention of the livestream, starting with Final Fantasy VII. In Final Fantasy VII, the Shinra Electric Power Company supplies the world with cheap, efficient electricity that is easily available everywhere. Thanks to their commercial monopoly on electricity in the world, they're a megacorp that has nearly full societal, political, and military control over the entire world. The energy they are supplying, known as Mako, is the world's actual life energy, also known as the Livestream. It's Final Fantasy VII's way of framing the way that we treat the planet's resources. It's also heavily suggested those who die return to the Livestream as their final resting place. Mako is generally shown as a bright blue greenish glowing substance with an ethereal quality to it. In Final Fantasy X, we have Pyroflies, souls of people who have died. Their look and place within the game world is based on the concept of Hitodama, a human soul of a recently dead person taking the form of a fiery apparition, said to be seen near graveyards and forests. You'll likely have seen them a lot in anime. You know how Goku's Genkidama means electric rice cooker? This secondary meaning is why it works as a pun. Pyroflies, when crystallized with water into a sphere, is what powers most of the technology in Final Fantasy X. This is the main technology behind the temples, how people in Spira record and broadcast audio and video, but it also powers the big blitzball pool. They also create the spheres you use to directly strengthen your character's stats and learn new abilities through the use of the sphere grid with. In Final Fantasy VII, we have Materia, small spheres of concentrated Mako that, when equipped, give you a stat boost and new abilities. In a more direct way, members of Soldier are injected with pure Mako to strengthen them, which brings us to Cloud Stripe's character in Final Fantasy VII. Late into Final Fantasy VII, we learn that there's a lot wrong with Cloud, as the identity he held up for most of the game wasn't the real him. Not long before the attack on the Mako reactor at the start of the game, Tifa found and rescued him, and being worried about his well-being, pushed Cloud into a life direction where she could keep an eye on him. Nearing the end of the journey, his actual memories start coming back to him, making it clear that Cloud was never that cocky soldier first class that he introduced himself as through the entire game. His entire identity up to that point had been based on Zack, a soldier first class he'd met while serving as a faceless grunt in Shinra's military. The mixture of trauma from the incident in Nibelheim, effects of Mako poisoning after being experimented on as a rare survivor of that incident, and the death of Zack right in front of his eyes made him imprint the personality of what he'd wanted to become while desperately trying to deny his own nature, deeming himself a failure. The real Cloud is a much more open-minded and caring person, unless you count all the post-game materials, which you shouldn't. What I'm getting at is, the real Cloud doesn't exist as a person for almost the entire game. Tidus' journey at the end of Final Fantasy X ends on a very similar note. Zanarkand fell during an attack by Bevelle during a war between the established elite, which at the time were magic users, and people trying to create equality through the use of technology. To preserve his city, the ruler, VII, converted the souls of everyone still alive into faith to summon a dream world where Zanarkand could be preserved for all time. Then he covered himself in an armor to ensure nobody could disturb his eternal dream, before completely losing his mind and rampaging across the world, destroying all machina. His own daughter, Lady Yunalesca, stopped him by turning her own husband into a faith to summon an Aeon strong enough to stop him. In the process, she died and her husband's body was taken over by Yevon, becoming the new Sin over time. This is where Tidus comes in. A person from the dream Zanarkand, he's brought to Spira by the Faith to end Sin's cycle and end their endless dream state. When the Faith are finally put to rest, Tidus disappears, as he was never a real person during the course of the game. It's also worth noting that around the time all the pieces start coming together in both games, the main couples of both games end up having sex. They also show off the exposition about how the game world works with the same kind of visual presentation, but I just wanted an excuse to bring up the time that Barrett watched Tifa and Cloud getting it on after so much serious talk. While I was editing the footage for this video, I realized that Kimari also watches Tidus and Yuna, so hey, there's another thing. What makes it all the more interesting is the framing of the game worlds. Final Fantasy VII starts you off in a modern futuristic world where a corrupt megacorporation has control of every aspect of modern life for its inhabitants through a mixture of military power and convenience, while history books speak of an ancient race of highly spiritual people who vanished. On the other hand, Final Fantasy X gives us the opposite, taking place in an old-fashioned and spiritual world where a corrupt, organized religion is in control of every aspect of modern-day life for its inhabitants through a mix of religious fear-mongering and a gigantic monster backing those fears up. Speaking of giant monsters, according to the Final Fantasy Wiki, Sin was created to represent all kinds of natural disasters that exist in the real world. Meanwhile, its name suggests a shame that comes from their belief at it existing due to humanity having lived wrong and needing to atone for this. It also mentions that the weapons from Final Fantasy VII are like the monsters from Japanese kaiju movies, like Godzilla. If you're familiar with what Godzilla originally represents, you likely already understand why this is funny to me. Both these statements mean the exact same thing. The original Godzilla movie presents him as a force of nature and a result and punishment of messing with nuclear energy. What is especially interesting though is that in Final Fantasy X, the more organic and spiritual of the two games, Sin is a man-made creature that is finally put to rest by voluntarily bringing in a person not from this world, whereas in Final Fantasy VII, the weapons are made by the planet itself to deal with Genova, a hostile foreign element that crashed into the planet from space and is threatening to corrupt the world and its lifestream. Speaking of creatures born from the lifestream and faith, people with a strong enough will who are not properly sent to the far plane in Final Fantasy X have been known to come back in a physical form through the use of pyroflies. The first character we meet having achieved this is Auron, although we don't learn about it until much later in the game when Seymour keeps refusing to fucking die already. You know who else does this? Sephiroth. After being thrown into the lifestream by Cloud during the Nibelheim incident, he slowly starts to physically put himself back together in the northern crater. Not only that, but through the lifestream, he absorbs the planet's knowledge and takes control of people injected with the same Genova cells that were put into him before his birth. Seeing himself as a god after having lost his mind, not unlike Yevon going mad after creating the Dream Zanarkand and Sin in 10 and taking control of the bodies of the Faith who have defeated his shell. Just as Sephiroth is running a cult, Seymour continues to be a religious figurehead well after his death. This is far from the only similarity between the two characters, as Sephiroth drags Genova with him wherever he goes, a representation of what he considers to be his mother. Seymour possesses the Aeon of his dead mother, Anima, and they both make you fight against what's essentially their dead mother in their quest to basically destroy the world. Then we have Tidus, who came out of Dream Zanarkand through the Faith, a person who shouldn't exist physically being held up by pyroflies, acting as an optimist until he realizes the truth about himself and coming to terms with his lack of place in the world in the process. During most of his journey, the group doesn't fully trust or respect him, but they allow him to stay because Oren said so. And for most of the game, Wakka is nice to Tidus because he reminds him of his dead brother, Chapu, something that annoys Lulu because it reminds her that she's also looking at Wakka as a replacement for her dead lover, also Chapu. The party starts to actually accept Tidus for who he is rather than who they want him to be after going to the Far Plane, the place where the Pyreflies go after being sent. A lot of how the Far Plane is being shown in the game as a hub with many doors leading to past memories reminds me of the visual representation of Cloud's real identity being put back together by Tifa after falling into the livestream in Final Fantasy VII. And considering how both locations are represented, I don't think that's a coincidence. Then there's also Cloud putting up a front of someone who doesn't care because he hopes that makes him look cool, until he finally learns to accept his actual place in the world as a person and accepts that he does care about the world and those around him. When Yoshinori Kitase said that Final Fantasy VII and X take place in the same world, I think what he meant to say is how Final Fantasy X was made to contrast 7. Much in the same way that Final Fantasy VII takes place in modern-day Japan because it reflects our use of the planet's resources, and the way that Final Fantasy X is based on Susanoo no Mikoto. Are the games fully linked in terms of story and lore? Maybe. Probably not. In fact, a lot of this is contrasting itself so well that I almost feel like Square couldn't have done this intentionally because they are so bad at being internally consistent across multiple games. Still, especially with the way that the Far Plane works and the way that Pyreflies work and spheres work, I'm entirely convinced that it was all intentional. You may disagree, you may agree, I don't know. I hope that you learned something here today. Anyway, I wanted to make this video because I very much appreciate and respect Final Fantasy X, and I think it's a game that often gets a bad reputation from people who don't understand what is happening in it. Like the laughing scene being intentional, that is something that a lot of people to this day don't get somehow. It still gets used as this example of bad dubbing in video games when the Japanese scene is the exact same. Anyway, this was Aboveup, and this was just a theory. A game no, I'm not gonna do that. Anyway, I recently opened a Patreon. I'm quite happy with how it went. I was kind of afraid that a lot of people would get mad that I'm like panhandling or whatever, but people seem to appreciate that they have a way to support the channel. I've also started commissioning some art for the channel, so there should be some changes. I made a logo for the Beyond Dead videos. Those will come back soon. I just need to get rid of this fucking echo in this room so I can talk normally, which is gonna get hard if I like dub a game, you know, because I won't be able to hear like my voice echoing, so I can't tone the voice down. Now I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who has donated to Patreon. I don't know what I'm going to do in the future yet. Anyone on Patreon, you're free to like choose. Do you want me to read all your names out, or do you want me to just do a credits thing that nobody looks at? No, I mean, do you want me to do a credits thing? It's entirely up to you guys how I will conduct myself with this, because it's your money, it's your choice how you will be represented by this. The next video will likely be a review of Ys 1 and 2, depending on stuff happening before that I might do videos on. I am not sure yet, I don't know how fast I'm going to work on these things. But yeah, this was Aboveup, and I will see ya.